right, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the show brought to you by Wondrium, engaging educational content provider, giving you short-form videos, long-form courses, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries, and where they began with the teaching company, actual college courses by college professors. Let me tell you how this is done, by the way, why the quality is so good, because I've done 2 of them for them. You fly back to their headquarters, and they have studios there, and their scripts are professionally edited. Of course, the professors write the scripts of their content of the courses they've been teaching, but they're edited and reduced in size, and no, rambling sidebars and so on. You just get straight to the point. It's beautiful. Quality is great. And then they're all uploaded, and you can just watch them. You can just stream them as you're driving around, hiking, walking, doing chores, riding your bike, and listening to these courses. And so it's great. And you can just subscribe now through the show and get 2 years for the price of 1. This is the best deal ever. You should just do it right now. I'll just wait while you go on there. Wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, SHERMER. And I recommend starting off with my friend and longtime show guest, Bart Ehrman, EHRMAN. Bart is a historian of religion and a biblical scholar. This one, I've taken almost all the lectures in this course. You can see the yellow lines there, means I've listened to almost all of them. This one's called The Triumph of Christianity, From Jesus of Nazareth to the Holy Roman Empire. Explore the rise of Christianity. How did this happen? Right? You know the story. Saul on the road to Damascus becomes Paul and all that stuff. But how did it actually grow? And it's not as simple as you've been told. I mean, there's a lot of interesting calculations here of how this is done through missionary work, of course, through fecundity. And here, is a few lectures. Reasons for Christianity's success. What did it have that other religions didn't that was appealing to people? There are reasons for that. Miraculous incentives for conversion. You can have miracles if you convert. The exponential growth of the church. Right. This is like compound interest with money. It just grows and grows and compounds on itself. So you only need a 1% increase over the centuries, and you get, what do we have today? 2 billion Christians. Astonishing. Early Christian apologists, the conversion of Constantine, that made a difference, the beginnings of a Christian Roman Empire. Finally, the triumph of Christianity, gains and losses. Okay, check it out. Go to Wondrium.com/Shermer. Get 2 years for the price of 1. Support the show by doing that, by the way, as well as through Skeptic Society. We don't have a bunch of other advertisers trying to sell you pillows and slippers and painkillers and all that other stuff you see on other TV shows. Okay, just give us some support here by going to Wondrium.com/Shermer. All right, thanks for listening. So let's start with just kind of a pragmatic thing. You guys work together on all these books. How do you do that? How do you decide what book to research and write? How do you collaborate? Particularly for would-be writers out there who would like to do a book, how do you pick a topic and how do you go about doing it?
I think it's much harder to find a topic for us than people realize, and then present it to your publisher and hope they're willing to pay you for it to do this. It's like going back to school and learning, historical events. Working together, it just happened naturally, right? I'm so inquisitive, and we have completely different backgrounds. I mean, my background comes from fashion. His background comes from law.
And it's a good combination, because you just have to find out after a while, you're either compatible and you work together well, you do research. Trisha, what's her favorite thing, if you asked her, Michael, is getting into an archive somewhere and going through the actual documents. If they digitize everything all around the world, she'll be very disappointed because she'll miss the opportunity to go through files. And one of the things we do is we talk about subjects we'd like to do, and then is there something that we can do on that subject if a publisher says to us, go off and do it, that hasn't been done before? Now, obviously, if I'm doing the Kennedy assassination, I'm covering an area where hundreds and hundreds of books have been written. So what could possibly be new? But our view is you follow the evidence, you try to put together a story a little bit different than what's been told before, and you look for hopefully something new. The thing is, you read a book and you see what the subject is that we've done, and you think that's a natural, but you don't realize maybe that 2 or 3 or 4 ideas along the way got trashed or never made it up to,
But I
what
think
the
we
publisher
don't
likes.
stick to one subject. I think that's why it's very hard to block, particularly Gerald. He moves around, which I like, which is, and I think that is very, very, with me, mine started more in women's health, but I've always been madly interested in World War II and Nazis and Holocaust. So I could not get published here, but I got published in England. And he's got a history. It's strange because when you don't have a history of something, books, they categorize you into one subject. And this publisher Chris Lascelles was really good to me and allowed me to just go ahead and write my book.
Yeah, and I think,
which
Michael,
is a big difference.
Your question, or what you said, young aspiring writers who are looking for how they get a book done. I mean, the key thing is there's a bit of luck involved, and I know that sounds crazy, but your proposal has to land on the desk of an editor that's interested
Absolutely.
in it. And I've always felt that sometimes we send in a proposal and the editor likes it and says, okay, let's do a book on this. And if it landed on the desk of somebody else in the company, they might not have been interested. Publishing is a very unscientific process.
But it's amazing when you do send something in and you think it's so fabulous, it's so amazing, and they kind of go, no.
They immediately tell you
we're not going to do this.
Somebody did tell Trisha, a prominent editor in New York, in passing on her book.
I wasn't going to say this.
The Pharmacist of Auschwitz said the Holocaust isn't trending. I thought that was
well, that was even
they shall
more,
remain unnamed.
That was even more of a red flag for me. But the funny thing was I never expected the book to do as well as it did because it was just, a very small, unknown publisher.
Yeah.
And you never know.
And one last thing in the long answer to your simple question, I do believe this is key. You have to we work on a book for a year, 2, 3 years. We have to love it. If you're not passionate, if you're selling a subject or you're writing a book because you think it's timely, maybe I should do a book today on this banking crisis or whatever else. And even though that's not your passion, you're going to be stuck when you're 6 months or a year into it because it's going to become an ordeal to work with. You have to really be on fire about it.
I think you have to like each other as well.
Oh, if you're working with somebody, you better like them.
We enjoy working with each other because we can debate, which is a rare thing these days. We can debate about everything because our backgrounds are so different. So, I'll say to Joe, don't lawyer me down. Now, this is a regular person. And so we really, in the beginning, I don't think we thought it was going to be like it is. But it's been, 40-something years?
Yeah, she's my first go-to to make sure something is good.
And don't fashion him up.
That's right.
Well, culturally, we're so different as well. Being British, him being an American, it's also, and our backgrounds are so completely different.
Right. Well, if there's a theme through all your books, maybe it's this, and I mentioned I wanted to discuss evil. It's how do regular, normal people who are they don't look evil, they don't seem like they're just born to be evil, they're not extreme psychopaths, serial killers, whatever, they're just regular people, turn to the dark side. I mean, it could be your pharmaceutical, the Sackler family, it could be, well, maybe Mengele is not the best example, but the pharmacist, he seems like a regular guy. And then, or I remember in the 90s when I was teaching at Occidental College, they brought in Thomas Keneally, the author of Schindler's List book that was then, of course, made into a famous novel. And he made an interesting comment that had there not been a Second World War, Schindler and Amon Goeth, the concentration camp commandant, might have just been drinking buddies or business partners or something. And it's just like, and none of that would have happened. But, the circumstances drove one down one path, one down the other path. So let's think about what are those pathways. And let's start with the pharmacist of Auschwitz. Who was this guy and how did he end up becoming this horrible creature?
You want to? Yeah. Well, I think that at a younger age, he was definitely made fun of, told about the way he looked, his weight. I think he had a lot of complexes. And I think that coming into Auschwitz gave him a feeling of power. Now, I don't know whether he would have had done the things he did, which, with the gold, the teeth and everything. But it's so hard for me to think that, did he have this in him, or was it brought out by his environment? And because we have to remember, there were 7,000 people working at Auschwitz, and no one stood up. No one said, enough, this is terrible. So were all 7,000, including him? I don't know. He had no regrets. I mean, he went home, opened up a pharmacy. When, as you know, you read in the book, when he went home, they applauded him, they clapped him. So it wasn't like he ever said, no, I was terrible, I did a terrible thing. It's a very, I think the whole thing, you know, we were just discussing this morning. And, you know, no one in his family, you know, did he tell anyone? Did he tell Fritzi, his wife, or his girls? They won't talk about it, obviously. But there doesn't seem to be any regret in him. There doesn't seem to be, you know, I did terrible stuff.
But I think that
and he
makes
rummaged
sense.
through everything.
But that makes sense that there was no regret, because, Michael, you know, you address this in your book, The Moral Arc.
Yeah.
These perpetrators, let's call them, the Russians or Ukrainians today who are committing war crimes. The Russians are committing war crimes who were an accountant a year ago and couldn't imagine where they are. This decline into evil, such as it is, but you have to believe in some ways and justify for yourself that you're on the right cause, that you're doing something correct, and then the denial is so great that you can never give up afterwards. When it's over, you can't suddenly say, "Oh my God, I really was doing a terrible thing." You continue to justify it, and you know you've said this so well before. It's not immediate. It's not like a light switch. Capesius doesn't go as a former Bayer national representative in Romania and gets assigned drafted into the Waffen-SS and goes over to Auschwitz, and then suddenly is evil. It's 15 volts at a time, as you say.
Right.
You know, back to the old Milgram experiment and what you redid.
But I think what's so different about Capesius is the fact that when he was on the front deciding whether he went left to death or right, he actually knew some of the people.
Yeah.
So he's looking, you know, he let the husband go to the right and the mother and the daughter. He knew them. So could I do that? Could you do that? Could you? I don't know.
That's a fascinating issue.
I mean, it's really unbelievable.
We think of the selections at the Ramphead by the Nazi doctors, Mengele and others. So they are selecting what they view as this inferior race. They're coming in, they're packed in the summer of 44 in terms of, the Great Hungarian transports, hundreds of thousands in Transylvania. And here come, and they're dirty from the days of traveling in the car. They smell. The Nazis are looking at them as less than human, and they divide them into these groups. But Capesius, different than any other Nazi ever at that Ramphead, has people coming off the cars who knew him because they were Jewish doctors, Jewish dentists, they taught at schools, and patients who knew him from the time that he was distributing Bayer drugs before the war. And when they saw him, they said, "Oh, there's Capesius, even though he's in the pressed Nazi uniform. He'll help us," because they were friendly before the war. No other SS person was in that. Did he flinch? Did he have a second hesitation? Did he worry about that? No. He split up families, and he did exactly what you would expect a good Nazi to do, without any emotional connection to those people who had been his friends before the war.
Right. So why don't people stand up, right? When you lecture on the Milgram experiments, you know, all the students all go, "I wouldn't do that." Well, you don't know you wouldn't do that. And, you know, if I was living in Nazi Germany, I would have stood up and, probably not, actually, right? And not just because we have different norms now than they did, but also it's hard to stand up. And, 7,000 employees at Auschwitz workers, not one stood up. Okay, so what are the risks of being the one? Right?
Well, yes, but
there was one that
there was this Dr. Monk, who was a friend of Mengele's, refused to do the selections. And what did they do? They didn't kill him. By the way, everybody always says, "Oh, if you didn't follow orders, they kill you." They didn't. They put it on his record. It was a demerit. They put him out at the subcamp of Monowitz. He had to look at blood slides. But so you could say no, but very few did, because that groupthink is very powerful as it goes along.
It's almost like a brainwashing as well.
Yeah, we'd all like to think we're the ones capable of standing up and doing it, but don't know until you're there.
But the thought that someone like Capesius could put the Cyclone B and and know that women and children, innocent women and children, for what reason? What was he thinking?
But but you know that Michael's
just part of the machine.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
I know that.
But
I know.
They like to think that they have a moral authority from on high because they've been ordered to do it.
Well, I think
that's the order,
there's
and
also
therefore they don't question
a power thing. There's a power thing. For someone like him that was so downtrodden when he was young, it gives, once they put that uniform on, it gives them this kind of authority and this power. You'll do as you're told, because he was quite brutal to people.
Yeah. Himmler went from somebody who would have been teased as sort of the nerdy, inefficient, unathletic Aryan to becoming the great vision of Aryan superiority. So, yes, some of them did transform inside the uniform into a sense of authority and power that they would never have had in civilian life.
That's right. Himmler was a chicken farmer.
Yeah.
But some of the really wicked, evil, a lot of them, which there've been books like, were the women that were there.
Right.
And I think, Michael, one of the things that we sort of have this discussion all the time, you can't have it in a book. If you're doing a biography, as she does on Capesius or I'm doing on Mengele, you lay out the facts of the story. And we don't have these, larger discussions. But people like Robert J. Lifton, have had the story, what makes Mengele. What amazes us in part is that after the war, if you look at the numbers, there are fewer than 24 of the Nazis who served at any of the camps who committed suicide within a 2-year period. Otherwise, except for those who, they weren't racked by guilt.
No.
They didn't suffer. They didn't talk to their families about it. They went back to work as insurance agents and as lawyers and as doctors and as other things if they weren't on the run. And they didn't kick the family dog and beat the wife. They didn't show any of the pathological behavior that they'd shown in the camps. So we are also, I think, not only bothered by the fact that this cultured, wonderful, and intelligent country, Germany, which gave us so much in the past in terms of history and philosophy, and that turned into this evil period during World War II, but that after the war, those responsible for it, who mostly weren't prosecuted, returned to normal lives and helped us in the Cold War without feeling very guilty about it.
It's almost like they were Jekyll and Hyde. This double, when you think Auschwitz, the wives and the children used to come and visit.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And plant flowers. And
Mengele had his wife to Auschwitz
and
twice.
She got sick.
She said, what's that odd odor? What's that odor?
It's a sweet odor.
Yeah. And he said, don't ask about that.
Well, they had rules and regulations in Auschwitz, traffic lights. I think Mengele got a traffic ticket.
He did get a traffic ticket for speeding and going through a light. Hard to believe. But it makes sense, Michael, in the sense that if you don't have rules and regulations in a place like Auschwitz, then it's Dante's Inferno. It's true. There's nothing. So the Nazis among themselves had to feel as though they had some sense of order. They were responding to something that made sense. They had to take a break to go down the Sola River to this little area and have a week off for that. And they had to get permission to do that. And they got demerits if they didn't work hard inside the camp. It's hard to imagine, but it was a system where the bureaucracy still worked efficiently.
Well, they had people working with them, like, IG Farben and Bear. So, there were other people outside of the camp that knew what was going on. I mean, they were literally being worked to death.
Indeed.
Right. It's good to remember that the word genocide was not coined until 1945, Raphael Lemkin, as a crimes against humanity. That's a new idea. Previously, no one really thought genocide was all that bad as long as it didn't happen to them. Right? It's just those other people. And even Holocaust denial is kind of a new phenomenon because now there's a sense, well, we need to deny this. Before, there was no, why bother? Right?
It's interesting,
Different norms, yeah. And I wrote down Operation Paperclip, right? So we had the United States brought a lot of these Nazi doctors and scientists to the United States who did some of the same things that we put other Nazis on trial for at Nuremberg. As war criminals, all the way up to Werner von Braun, who was quite aware of the slave labor deaths at Peenemünde, where they were building the rockets that eventually led to the technology that put us on the moon, right? So, but even some of the chemical and biological weapons, as long as they're on our side, well, okay, then we're going to treat them differently.
No, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, there was a race after the war between the Soviets and us for Nazi rocket scientists. Both sides were looking, and we knew immediately the Cold War had started. So that's why the United States was able to make a deal with somebody like Klaus Barbie, who had run a very, very difficult, group against the resistance inside Lyon. He knew he had a network of people and we wanted that network. We wanted those names. So we gave him his freedom as a result of that, or otherwise he would have been standing trial. And people sometimes ask us, did the U.S. do a deal for Mengele? Did he get away because they? And it turns out, no, not at all. Well, the Americans had him twice in a camp, like, the millions of displaced people, and they didn't know it was him. But the reason they weren't interested in Mengele's work is because that was based upon the idea of this fake, false racial superiority science that the Nazis had developed, which they taught at the medical schools when Mengele was going to medical school, which he believed. He was trying to perfect this Aryan race and figure it out. What we were interested in terms of the medical experiments, were those at some of the other camps where they put a prisoner in a vat of ice for 2 hours and see how long they would survive. That told them what happens if your plane was shot down over the Arctic. How long did you have to get to a pilot? Those types of things, terrible as it was, that cold calculus, that the Americans and the Soviets wanted, but they weren't interested in the racial experiments. They knew that was malarkey.
Right. Yeah, right, exactly. So here I was thinking of Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect. So, Phil has this idea that it's mostly bad barrels, not bad apples, and that the bad barrels corrupt the apples, right? So like Abu Ghraib, or his own Stanford Prison Experiment, which I know has been challenged as a little bit more orchestrated than perhaps bottom-up processes at work there. But Abu Ghraib, he has this example of the guy who was in charge of Abu Ghraib when the abuses happened. And if you look at his history, he's just a normal all-American soldier. He was a football player. He was this, that. Chip, I forget his last name now, but then you put him in this environment, and 6 months down the line or a year down the line, they're doing these abuses of the prisoners. Yeah. So how does that happen? Right. That's the interesting question. And, I think the answer in human nature, well, it's got to be both, right? I mean, most people, most of the time, do the right thing and they're moral and upstanding, but you can corrupt quite a few people, again, setting aside the extreme psychopath, serial killer types. Where would you put Mengele? What was his background that led to that? Other than, he really believed the race science. Okay, so there's kind of a logic in his head, what he's doing, right? But what else is in his background that led him to become, the angel of death?
Yeah, so here's somebody you want to think, and I use this in a general sense. It would be better if you thought that Mengele was somebody who was the last in his medical class. He was just barely competent. He had 105 IQ. He came from a rough background. No, it's just the opposite. He graduates near the top of his class. He gets a PhD. He's a star student. He comes from a very well-to-do family. He's steeped in culture and German culture, and he listens to classical music. All the things we say, okay, there's not a bad guy, and he is, because his ambition is overriding. And today, Michael, if we had camps in the United States for some religious, ethnic, social reason, whatever else, you had camps that were operating and the government was putting people away, I guarantee you might disagree with this, but there would be some doctors somewhere along the line who would say, you know what, I'm not making those camps up. I'm not sending those people there, but I can come up with a cure for cancer or a cure for a deadly disease by running this experiment on these people beforehand. They'll serve a purpose. And Mengele viewed the people at the camp as completely expendable, and thought that after the war, he would be honored by going back to Frankfurt or Berlin as one of the sort of lions of the new Nazi racial sciences.
But I think he went a step too far. He became more like a mad scientist in the end.
Yes.
It may have started that way, but, the changing of the color of the eyes, experimenting on people, men and women when they were no anesthesia. It was like a mad scientist in the end.
So interesting what you said a moment ago, Michael, about Abu Ghraib. And you're absolutely right. The longer you're there, the worse your behavior comes. Something very interesting about Mengele. If you look at the crimes and the witness statements against him, now it's like saying what's worse, a serial killer or, they're all bad. But the worst of the charges against him, the things of throwing a baby on a pit, ripping a woman apart, they come later in his service there. And so he doesn't start off in the very beginning like that. He becomes worse and worse. And I interviewed a doctor years ago in the preparation for the Mengele work, Dr. Monk, who had served with him. And Monk said to me, in essence, go and talk to the people who were special forces in Vietnam. Find out what they did by cutting off the hands of a Viet Cong and putting it on the front of a stick in the village to scare people off. And now they're back to regular lives in America. They probably can't imagine what they did. In Auschwitz, if I dropped you in a parachute the first day, you would have been horrified by what was taking place around you. And 5 days later, you'd still be horrified, but a little less so. And a month later, there'd be a normalcy to it. You became accustomed to the madness of Auschwitz, and that's not to excuse it. I'm not saying that, but I think that people become inured to that step by step.
I think you could use an example of the person that put you in the direction of Mengele, Mark Berkowitz. Mark Berkowitz said he was good to me.
Yeah, the twin who came to me when I had a pro bono lawsuit to sue Mengele family and the German government. That's how I got involved first in the Mengele case. We were unsuccessful in doing that. Mark Berkowitz and his twin sister, they had survived Mengele, but Mengele liked him. And he called him the messenger. And he sent Mark on errands to bring a piece of paper to this part of the camp or that part of the camp. And Mark saw parts of the camp that most of the twins never did because they were never outside of the barracks. And Mengele was kind to him, but it was a kindness done in order to have him, when he did an experiment on him or did injections, he would say, you're a good boy. He would pat him for not crying. So the kindness, the carrot, was in order to get better behavior out of his victims, if that makes sense. It's the ultimate cruelty in working with children.
But that the fact that he went into hiding, as did many of them, right after the war, they must have, on some level, known, you know what, we did was wrong and we're going to get in big trouble for this. Or is it not that? Just that, well, we lost. Had we won, we'd be fine. But
no.
Well, but Mengele went under his own name.
Yeah, so
he went under his own name. I mean, you look at Capesius wasn't embarrassed or ashamed. Well, because he thought he served his time.
Capesius went back and did his and opened up a pharmacy. And with Mengele, the only reason that he left his family and went to this little farm in Rosenheim in southern Germany, and he was under an alias because he had appeared in the wanted papers that the British had compiled during the war about war crimes. And so he was one of those, and so he stayed there. And what the Mengele family, we now know from letters, said is, hey, you've got to stay there until it all blows over. And then in 1948, the lousy British show the Germans it's not blowing over. They have the doctors' trials, and they put doctors on, some of whom Mengele knew. And then the family says, oh, this isn't blowing over. We've got to get you out of Germany for a while. And he does go to Argentina. But by 1956, he goes into a West German embassy in Buenos Aires and says, by the way, my name is not Helmut Greger, the card under which I arrived. My name is really Joseph Mengele. And he changes his name to his correct family name. No one in the West German embassy looks up on the wanted list. He goes back to Switzerland for a skiing vacation as Mengele. And he's in the phone book in 1958 in Buenos Aires under Mengele. He only changes that when he's officially indicted in 59, and then Eichmann's kidnapped, and that's the end of them being in the open. But pretty amazing when you think of why they fled. When his son confronts him years later, goes down in 77, Rolf then is 33, his only son, and Mengele is 66, and confronts him about Auschwitz. The son wants to hear, I hated it there. It was horrible. But I was ordered to, I had to do my duty. And instead, Mengele defends it and says, you, the son, you will never understand what we were trying to achieve. So don't even try. Don't question me about Auschwitz, because I won't tolerate any questions about it.
That's right.
And that sends the son leaves that meeting just absolutely reeling. All these years later, Mengele believes he's the victim, forced to live in South America on the run because the victors have had their justice.
But so did Capesius think he was the victim.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think they all think they're victims.
Yes, that's right.
You know, I mean, the thing with Mengele as well I find fascinating was when he would write back and forth to Rolf, that he would talk about the way his wife looked, and her skirt was too short, and you know, Rolf's the daughter-in-law was a twin.
Yeah.
As well, so he was even more fascinated.
But it is interesting that, and you've seen this, Michael, how what I call neo-Nazis or apologists for the Nazis, or in the case of Wolf Hess, who we both interviewed, the son of Rudolf Hess, they will say,
unrepentant.
They say victors write the justice. So the reason the Nazis are war criminals is because you won the war. If we had won the war, we would have put on trial the pilots who were in the Enola Gay and those who made the decisions to firebomb Dresden and Hiroshima, and Tokyo, and then drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's not the same moral equivalency at all.
But when we met him in New York, he was unrepentant.
Your wolf has.
And I was amazed he would even talk to me because I'm Jewish and British.
But Michael, if I can say, I think your audience will understand this. You talk about deniability, or the ability to deny responsibility for terrible crimes. In the case of Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's slavish deputy, he was enamored by Hitler. He flew to England to try to get England to come to a peace deal, and it didn't work out. But he flew to England before there was the Wannsee Conference, before there was an official decision to exterminate the Jews of Europe. So the son could then believe, and he said to us with a straight face, I think my father would have objected to it. Of course, that's balderdash. It's absolutely not true. There's no chance that would have happened. But he, to his dying day, he's dead now, the son, he believed that if his father had been there, he would have said, no, that's not right, mein Führer. We can't kill all the Jews.
No, that's right. Yeah, there's so much hindsight bias that goes on with our perspective today of how we feel people should be treated and so forth is so different from just half a century ago or a century ago. I was just on a kind of a side note, I was watching Kareem Abdul-Jabbar talking about, he does a lot of activism against racism and so on. And, he makes these comments like, well, the founding fathers should have known better. They knew that, treating blacks this way. I don't really know that that's the case, right? I mean, maybe you have some of these Quakers who objected to slavery and they did participate in the abolition movement, but there weren't many, right? And the most vocal objections to the abolitionist movement was by Christians that just felt, well, no, this is totally good for these black people. We're going to save their soul, give them culture, and it's a better lifestyle than they had in Africa. And, they had all these justifications that we find ridiculous today, so it's like, again, judging people of the past by our current standards can be pretty problematic. We do this. There's a lot of canceling of, people like John Wayne because of comments he made in the early 60s about Native Americans and blacks and so on. Or if you go back further, how Jews were described or women were described. Richard Dawkins makes the point, you can tell approximately to the decade when a novel was written based on how women and blacks and Jews are described, right? It's like wouldn't.
It's absolutely true. And John Wayne could be canceled just for playing Genghis Khan.
I know.
That'd be the worst casting I think ever.
Ever.
But what you say is we do increasingly, it seems to me, tend to judge past events through this current moral prism of what are, and doing that is just it's a useless task. You can't do it. And so even when let's say you weren't an abolitionist when the country was founded, but you weren't a slave owner as well. There were people who decided not to have slaves. They didn't have slaves. But they weren't abolitionists as well. It wasn't like there was just a mind think that everyone went along with this. And people forget. I think that many people forget that what the founding fathers said in that, yes, all men are created equal. And then people say, okay, it meant only white property owners. But guess what? It was a revolutionary statement at a time when royal families considered to have royal blood were running all of the countries in Europe. At a time when at France and at this point, England and Germany and others had no concept other than serfs and people at the bottom who served the royals. The idea that you could even say something like that. So if you put your, you always say you have to try, and I've seen you do it before in your books. You do it in the moral arc. You say we need to put our feet into the shoes of those who were the perpetrators to try to understand what they were. But the same with the founding fathers at that time.
The problem is today, I mean, like the conversation you're having now, one can't have a normal debate anymore. And it's not even a debate, it's a conversation to see both sides of something. That's just not allowed anymore.
Yeah, debate.
So for you to try and explain that, or for you to try, or for me, it's very, very difficult. It's it doesn't exist. It shuts us down completely.
Yeah, that is a problem. If you went to,
So you went to a university of college
and said, let's have a debate about the founding fathers, and whether what they did was terrible and they should have known better, or what they shouldn't have known better and they did good. At some point, it's not going to be too far into that debate that you'll be shouted down if you're not condemning the founding fathers, and that's unfortunate because I sort of grew up, in high school debate and college debate. I was on the debate team all the time, went and became a lawyer. My idea was that you put out the worst ideas into the public marketplace, and then you destroyed those ideas by showing through logic and evidence why they were bad. But you didn't shut them down. You didn't say, don't suggest that. You let people put them out, and then you debated it, and people came to their own conclusions. But that's increasingly not the case.
Yeah, I'm fond of pointing out Holocaust denial is mainly an American phenomenon because it's one of the few countries where it's not illegal.
But there's something else going on, because I meant to say this when you said Holocaust denial, and you can finish that off. There's a new way of saying it. Holocaust was a myth.
Oh, right.
This is in Norway?
The Netherlands.
Netherlands. I think it was 25% of the young population. So it's a myth. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, for me, coming, as a World War II baby.
So I might be completely wrong on this. I know it's hard to imagine I could be completely wrong, but I could be.
What?
Don't believe them.
But I have this idea that, so I'm raised Catholic, although my father was Jewish. Trisha is all Jewish, good English, Jewish girl. And I think that some of the reasons for the Holocaust denial is that the real haters, the real anti-Semites, believe that the Jews are so diabolical.
Yeah, agreed.
They control so much that somehow they were able to pull off this idea of the Holocaust. And later, the sympathy of the world was so great that Israel was formed. And all these decades, nobody says to the Armenians who had a genocide, oh, you probably were so clever, you were able to make the whole thing up and that. But Jews, for some reason, they control the world according to the anti-Semites. They have all these false premises that are said all the time, the finances, a cabal you can't trust, they've got control of the government. They must have somehow faked the Holocaust.
The interesting thing after World War II, it was even worse for the Jews in England, particularly in London, because they blamed us. And therefore, when I went to school, all Jews have big noses, all Jews have big feet, swastikas on your zest, dirty Jew. It was bad. Then you had Colin Jordan, you had Paisley, you had marches everywhere. It was really bad in England after World War II. You would think it would have been better, but it was not, because we got blamed for it. And getting a job was very difficult as a Jew. I mean, as I tell Joe, my last maiden name is Levine. And my mother came up with this genius idea. Well, let's change it to Lee. And I'm like, Mummy, really? Lee? It doesn't really sound like it's a big deal.
Well, Kanye West, Yee's recent comments, and people go, oh, well, he's manic depressor. It's like, it's just not really an excuse. He's reflecting, though, some of the anti-Semitic tropes that are still floating around. Yeah, right? Because he points out, oh, the Jews run the media, or, they run Hollywood. They take too much profit from record producers and so on.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because there's Trisha and I have, and she's really the force behind it, founded last year a small nonprofit called Anti-Semitism Watch. Her passion is sort of trying to make a dent on this anti-Semitism. And some of the groups that go out, that work with her, go out literally just with a microphone to different communities, into a group of people that have come together for spring break. They'll talk to whites, to blacks, to Asians, to everybody, and they'll say sometimes, so tell me the first word that comes into mind when I say, and they'll say Democrat, Republican. When they say Jews, you'll be shocked, maybe you won't be shocked, how many people say rich, 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 as if no Jew is, just working at $35,000 a year at a double shift job or that. And that stereotype, because of so many successful ones, buries the idea that there is, in fact, real immigrants who arrived here, had to work their way up from nothing. England. And the idea of rich. And when I saw those, I thought to myself, those are the innocent stereotypes, if it makes sense. Those aren't people who necessarily go out. They don't think they said anything wrong. They wouldn't say it to a podcaster who's asking them that to put on social media. They think that's the fact. But that's sort of the basis of then the disinformation that can be built on, as you so well know. So it becomes a tsunami of stereotypical information.
But it has to come from the home, because I remember my mother telling me when I was young that the children just don't grow up knowing those words, and that has to come from their home.
Or social media today.
Well, no, but there was no social media in those days. I mean, party line phones.
Yeah.
Certainly, some of that is self-fulfilling stereotyping. You mentioned, these Jews that are herded into these trains for days, and they get to Auschwitz and they're dirty and they stink and so on, and then the Germans look at them and go, "Well, of course, look at them, smell them.
Yeah,
I mean, they're
exactly.
they're less than human." Well, you did
Yes.
that to them. Or like the stereotypes of Jews being in the financial industry. Well, in the Middle Ages, they were discriminated against and blocked from all professions, so they went into
That's all they could do.
that's all they could do. So.
Well,
Michael,
they say that about in England, that they were all in the fashion trade. Well, when you came in as an immigrant, it didn't matter if you were a doctor or a lawyer. You couldn't. There was only certain things you could do.
So, and Michael, one of my favorite things is when we did God's Bankers, the book on finances.
Oh yeah.
So the church in the Middle Ages has this view. By the way, it's not proper for it's just improper to charge interest with money. You don't do that. You can't do that. That's really the province of heretical Protestants and Jews. So we don't want to do that. And then you have the French Revolution in 1789. And as that idea of freedom spreads a few years later, out of the Frankfurt ghetto comes the Rothschild family. Eamon Rothschild and his 5 sons. They were forced to do money changing inside the ghetto because that was their only profession. And they become, within one generation, the best and biggest merchant banking family in all of Europe. So much so that the Vatican and the Pope has to twice ask them for a loan, much to the disdain of the church. And one time, the Rothschilds say, by the way,
take the wall down.
Will you do something, please? This is the oldest ghetto in all of Europe, the Rome ghetto. Will you take the wall down? So the church takes the wall down. When the second loan is paid back, they build the wall back up, and they empower Catholic financiers to come into the business. So the Catholic financiers come in because the Rothschilds have such a jump on them because they were forced to do it.
I think something that Gerald found that was really fascinating is the reinsurance in the church.
Money, you talk about money. Generali, which is an Italian insurance company, one of the biggest. Generali had sent out in the late 1800s and early 1900s a group of agents to Eastern Europe to Generali was owned by Jews, to sign Jews up in Eastern Europe for life insurance policies. And they were really successful. They convinced them that the cash value of those policies was worth saving for families. They sold a surprising number. Come the war, of course, the entire top of Generali is now Aryan and fascist. During the war, the Vatican Bank invests in both Generali and in Allianz, which has similar policies. And those two companies decide in 1944, you know what? The Jews aren't coming back. So they take all the life insurance policies, the cash value. It makes enormous profits for the Vatican and for the companies. And after the war, those were the Jews sent to concentration camps. After the war, when the family showed up at those insurance companies and said, by the way, I want to collect because my uncle, my father was killed at Auschwitz or Treblinka, those companies demanded a death certificate, which was impossible to have. It's just a horrific story of not just, we talk about the Mengeles in the world with the blood on their hands, and we forget about the edge of it was a business. Remember the Nazis, as you always say, they were melting down the gold. They were taking the clothes. They were selling everything.
All the art.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go on forever and ever and ever.
They didn't just do death. Yeah. It was death. It was murder and business.
Yeah. Everything was used for repurposing. And if they cut the hair, there was a reason for it. They stuffed pillows. There was a reason.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Posner speech by Himmler that you can actually watch this transcribed on a YouTube video of this. And Himmler is basically scolding these people for abusing the corpses and stealing money from, it was the area in Auschwitz called Canada, where they were taking all the gold out of teeth and stuff like that. And some of the officers were stealing stuff, right? He's like, okay, we have to crack down on this, right? This is a business. Yeah. And, that's also a very interesting speech because he's reminding them of how difficult it can be for many people to kill like this. But if you do it enough, you get used to it. And we have to remember back in the day, you see 1 and then you see 5 and you see 500 dead but you get used to it, right? So he's kind of giving them a pep talk.
Yeah, you're right. But Michael, what's interesting is that Posner speech went on for like 3 hours, something like that, right? I think a little over 3 hours. Yeah. So what is great is that in Nuremberg, when Admiral Dönitz, who was the second Fuhrer, he's up for war crime charges, and his defense was I had no contact with the extermination program. I didn't know anything about it. And then they showed some speeches that he gave that were really anti-Semitic, and he said, "Oh, those were written by Goebbels' ministry. I just signed them. I didn't even actually deliver them." And then they thought the key point, but you were at the Poznan conference in which Himmler gave the speech, and his defense was, and they introduced some other soldiers who said it, he left before Himmler got to the part that you just described. So he was able to say, I didn't stay for the whole thing, I left. And that shows you how afterwards, even at the highest rank, this is a guy who runs the Navy, who's a high-ranking officer, they tried to distance them. Not everybody was willing to say, oh, what happened over there was so great in the East. There were those who wanted to say, I didn't know about it. I didn't hear that part of the speech. And he had to hear about it afterwards. That speech was talked about all over. But they tried to draw the distance from themselves if they could, to say, oh, yeah, that terrible Himmler and what he did, I'm just shocked.
What do you make of the concept of the banality of evil that comes out of the Eichmann trial? Just paper pushing bureaucrats.
Boy, we both really dislike that idea.
Especially after the tapes.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially after the Eichmann tapes. Anybody who hasn't seen those should see that. Show the Devil's Confession. It takes away. You say this, Trish, all the time. It takes away relieves the person of any responsibility for being other than a cog in a big machine. It's like saying, "Oh, I'm here, and I was ordered to do that, and so I just went ahead and did whatever I had to do, and I'm not responsible." And that's just garbage, and we know that time and time again. I think it's been misapplied. It was wrong when she first said it.
Yeah, let's apply that to the Sackler family, the whole problem we're going through now. There was just a story in this morning's paper that I think it's CVS or Rite Aid's being sued by the U.S. government, that even the people at these stores, these retail pharmacies that were writing scripts for these addictive painkillers, are now being held responsible, or at least the company, CVS itself, or maybe it's Rite Aid. Where do you draw the line? I mean, so you start in your book on Big Pharma, with the Sackler family at the top, and work your all the way down. But it's interesting because when I read that book, Sackler seemed like a decent guy, right? I mean, he's like, oh, well, we're going to help people with pain, and I'm going to fund these art museums. I'm going to do all these charitable things with the money I'm making. And then something along the way, it's like, at what point did they know, right, that it was addictive and it was going to cause death? And then they continued anyway, right? That's kind of what we want to know.
Well, Arthur wasn't around at that point.
Yeah, he wasn't, but the Sackler brothers.
Sackler brothers were around,
I think that they knew from the time they marketed in 96 that they were downplaying the addiction numbers. All right, they had this one study that was off the charts that said, it could be 1.5% to 2%. But that's sort of like, the outlier. That happens, okay? You get the outlier, you throw them out. You take them on both ends, you throw them out. They didn't. They took the most outrageous sample and they said, that's the truth. That's the mainstream. And then they over-marketed through the salespeople from the beginning what it could apply to. And then when you talk about other responsibility, in 2001, the FDA came in and said, are they over-marketing? And they put together 10 advisors, put them on a panel. 8 of them had ties to pharma companies like Purdue. And they said, no, the marketing's fine. So they went along with it. And then in 2007, Purdue pleaded guilty to misbranding the drug and over-marketing it, $600 million fine, and went right back to what they were doing before. So it's not so much a slide there. There they pushed the envelope from the start, and they got away with it.
Well, they
the
got
oversight
greedy.
was bad. They
got greedy. They got greedy. They got this power thing.
And when you talk about the pharmacies, I said the same thing. Okay, what are the national chains doing in this? They're just filling, that was their defense. We're just filling legal orders. But when you actually look into the case, there are instances in which they are also filling fake prescriptions that look like something, Michael, that you would have made if you just had a couple of beers and decided to make a funny prescription on a napkin at a local restaurant. And I would say to you, what are you, nuts? That doesn't look like a prescription. And they would accept those and fill the orders.
But it was also these small towns.
Yeah, in which 5 million pills are going to a town with 3,000 people, and the distributors like AmerisourceBergen and are not telling anybody at the FDA, we think you have a problem. Pill mill doctors who are illegal drug clinics. Purdue's not reporting them. They were selling more to them. So it's a process in which I don't know to the extent to which this happened, but I think many of them felt safe because everyone else was doing it, if that makes sense. So you had so many partners in the supply chain, at the pharmaceutical level, at the doctor's level, the high prescribers, 5% of the doctors doing 80% of the prescriptions. And you thought, well, we aren't doing anything wrong. We're just manufacturing it. And they're all complicit in sort of this like slide into leaving this lethal chain destruction behind them.
Right. I remember there was a 60 Minutes episode where they were interviewing one of these physicians that wrote, a gazillion prescriptions, and he was still defending himself. Oh, well, this guy was in pain and this woman had, chronic, whatever, kind of justifying it. At some point you have to know, and I guess the greed, the profit is just so much, like this SBC bank, corruption. It looks like it was just, well, we got away with it. And as long as it keeps going, or like a Bernie Madoff, he probably started off normal. Yeah, that's for sure. And then at some point it's like, well, I'm just going to cheat the system a little bit right here until I catch up. And then I'll go back to, to all legal. And then it doesn't happen. And you just, 15 years later, boom, the whole thing blows up. And it's like, at what point, right? That's the critical question. What point do you cross the moral line there? This is wrong and you're just going to do it anyway. That's hard to say.
Yeah, no, it is hard to say. You're right. And I think that often, and we know this on Madoff and that we looked at for a while. I had a friend who wrote a book, you justify for yourself a long time the fact that I'm going to straighten this out. I'm going to make this better. Now, at a certain point, it's impossible. You're never going to be able to do it because too much has been stolen. Then it becomes a real scheme. But I think that, they delude themselves to thinking in the beginning that they're just bad people who were put in a bad spot. And then it got out of hand.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about restorative justice, another interesting topic. So you mentioned, the Vatican and these insurance policies and art. It's like you go to Germany. My wife's from Cologne, so all over Germany, there's these little stumbling stones, these little brass cubes that are embedded in the sidewalks that describe the Jews that lived at this house right here. And, this is the date they were deported, and here's the camp they went to, and here's the day they were murdered. And it's like it's very moving. But then I'm thinking, what if I was one of the family members of the person who owned this house? It's nice to have that little stumbling stone, but I want the house.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see that. I mean, you've seen Lensman's Shoah, right? That amazing film in which the children of the Jews from small Polish villages go back and see some of the townspeople who say, "Oh yeah, I remember you. Yeah, you were the Jews. I remember that was your house Jews, over there now. Jews, now it's no idea of giving the house back." There has been some tremendous work by lawyers, by groups, by the in the end the World Jewish Congress and others to bring Germany to some form of restitution. You can't pay for these crimes. I get that. So you're going to give money for something that can't be really compensated in terms of money, but is better than nothing. There have been efforts that continue to this day to get the art back. The World Jewish Congress led the effort in the 1990s together with, at that time, Edgar Bronfman, to get the Swiss insurance companies and others in the Clinton administration got that effort to get all the insurers to get together because they had ripped off so many people, and they did a settlement. The only sovereign entity in Europe that refused to attend the conference initially and then refused to participate in the eventual payout was the Vatican. We forget that's a sovereign entity, but they did refuse. They got away with it. Yeah. Amazing they did. I mean, I've called in the New York Times, LA Times, and Washington Post in op-eds for the Pope to open up the World War II files, and they sort of, back in the Vatican, they just laugh at me. But the idea of this restorative justice, we're still finding paintings that have questionable provenance and can't put it all together.
And they're trying to take those paintings and put them in the Jewish Museum. Right. That's what they're trying to do. Like if Sotheby's has it up or somebody, they're trying to take them back and put them in the museum. If they can't find the family or where it came from, but they know the period the piece was taken from.
And Michael, one of the things, and you know this very well, but some of the people listening to this may not realize it. They will think that the Nazis just went into a museum and they picked what they wanted. They walked out with it. They went into the home of some Jewish person who had been sent back to Poland and they took the art. The Nazis were clever enough to set up an entire judicial system and legislative system that law by law took away the rights of Jews over a period of time, and then eventually allowed for this confiscation to take place through legal means. And people like Goering, who stole the most, would apply and sometimes fight with other Nazis over the title to a special piece of art, and it would go to a German judge to decide where it would be, which gave them the feeling not that they were thieves, but that they were just following the laws of the new Third Reich for 1,000 years.
But if it was a Jewish artist, they would destroy it.
Yeah.
They would destroy anything that was done, whether it was books or art, that would be destroyed.
Yeah, you see some of these cases come up. Yeah, degenerative art, right? You see some of these cases like a piece of art that's worth, I don't know, $10 million, but it's changed hands like 3 or 4 times through art distributors, each of whom paid more and so on. And then the family members want it back. Well, but the person that has it didn't even know the origin of it, right?
That's
so
right.
It's like, how did that seems like a difficult one. How are they compensated?
Okay, so in terms of law, and I step out of my area of legal practice that I used to have 40 years ago, and so I'm sure some lawyer who specializes in this will then send you a message that says that guy Posner doesn't know what he's talking about. But I understood from law school that it didn't matter that you didn't know you bought a stolen item. And I'm not talking art here, but anything. So that you went on the street and you bought a car, and that Mercedes seemed like a great buy at $20,000, it was really $40,000 on the lot. Doesn't matter, even if in good faith you bought it thinking the title was correct. If it turns out that it's stolen, you're out the money. That's the risk that you're taking as the buyer. And in the art world, where we know they're fake, so now you're talking about the people buying these are art dealers, they're museums in some cases who are acquiring them. And it's not as though we're dealing with a piece of art that is done by Warhol in the 1970s. So you know it didn't come from the Holocaust. You're dealing with a piece of art, sometimes an old master, that has a history of provenance behind it. And when you start to follow it into World War II and you can't follow it any further, that should be all the warning signs you need before you part with your money to buy it.
Interesting. I was just watching on Netflix or maybe Amazon Prime the other day that film about the 9/11 Survivors Fund that Congress approved, I think in 2002, $7 million, or was it $1 billion, whatever it was a lot of money. And then, Bush appointed Ken Feingold, I think it was, in charge of this. So the film is about, how do you judge the worth of a human person, a human life, right? But there are lawyers that do this. I was astonished to read about this, right? Like when Ford Motor Company gets sued by, the victims of a family of a victim from a car crash, they have to put a dollar on it, right? Okay, it's $10 million or $5 million or whatever the number was. And so he's kind of having to make these calculations. And you think, well, you just take the total sum and divide by the total victims of 9/11. Not so easy, right? Because so the Wall Street trader on the 90th floor of the World Trade Center building makes $5 million a year. And the waitress at the restaurant at the top of the building makes $35,000 a year. The family should get something different, but of course the families of the waitress are like, why is her life worth less than his life? That doesn't seem right.
It is extremely difficult, and that's one of the reasons so interesting in German restitution. After the war, when Germany finally agreed to do restitution, they said same amount for everybody in the camp a month. It was a small amount. It was like $130 in the 1980s when I was dealing with Berkowitz. Didn't matter if you were a child who was experimented on by Mengele, you were somebody who was in the camp for 1 week at the end of the war. You were in the camp, you were able to show that you were, then you received that. So that's how they just kept it the same. As bad as that was, it was better than Austria, which gave nothing at all and said, oh, by the way, we were victims. Poland, which said, oh, we were victims. I understand that. And, and so Germany at least had made some step for it, but they didn't get into the process of figuring out. It would have been a never ending process.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a hard one. I guess the more limited it is, the more you can make the calculations. But when it's so vast like that, it's like the problem with the reparations issue about, the descendants of slaves in America. Boy, once you go down that path, what percentage of descendants do you have to be to get what percentage of money? And if you're going to do that, what about the Native Americans? I mean, they had their lands just stolen. Yeah. I'm fond of saying, when Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, it wasn't Napoleon's to sell and it wasn't Jefferson's to buy, right? And at some point, it's like, where does the value come from? Well, it's just conquest or whatever.
And I think of this sometimes, on the issues about reparation. We've talked about this. So what happens if you were, let's say, a family whose great 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 grandfather fought on the Union side and died in trying to save the republic? What if your great great grandfather was an abolitionist, fought to abolish slavery, but now as the descendants of that abolitionist, I'm going to pay the same amount of taxes, let's say, toward a reparation verdict as somebody who was a plantation owner? It's very and even in Germany, if you think, sometimes you can't make these distinctions; it's too large. But German taxpayers paid many of the restitution figures afterwards, after World War II. But what if you were a German family that was like, at that time, there were Stauffenberg, who had been one of the lieutenants to try to kill Hitler. What if you were part of the resistance in Nazi Germany? You didn't go with Hitler. You fought. You lost a family member to it. Or you were a member of a Romani family who some of them died when they had euthanasia or in the early days. Now you're contributing to the same fund as if you were the child of an SS officer. So these general payments, regular reparations, or there's an inherent amount of unfairness in them that is the nature of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Hitchens made this argument about reparations. Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, right? Even if you can't do it perfectly, but we should do something.
That's the argument. That's exactly right. So when you start to point out where the problems are, you say, well, what about this and what about that, and how many generations you have to go back? The general answer is, well, let's do so something.
So you could say that for the Jews.
But there's always a limit, because as Trish always says, she's ready for maybe there should be reparations from Egypt for Jews who had to build the pyramids.
Build the pyramids. I mean, you could keep going back.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Hitchens, that comment came, he did a debate on the Elgin marbles, or Elgin marbles, I guess they're pronounced, right? And, they want them back from the British Museum, and the Brits are like, oh, no, they're ours now.
Yeah, the Brits had that sort of great answer, which is, hey, we stole them fair and square.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's really funny. What are your thoughts on the idea of no Hitler, no Holocaust, no Hitler, no maybe even World War II, right? That one person can be so responsible for so much evil.
Well, it could have been someone, the economy and everything at that time.
It was, but so what if you had, let's say, Trisha, what if Churchill had been the prime minister instead of Chamberlain? Right. What if somebody had stood up to him and pushed back when he was the mini bully and went into the Ruhr Valley?
I think what you're saying that if there was no Hitler.
That's right. But the same question then can be asked, I think fairly so. Sometimes there is an overriding personality of such strength that they pull together.
But at the right time.
Right. And that's,
it has to be it has to be an opportunity. It was an opportunity of time.
And that's Stalin, clearly in Russia. It's Mao in China. So that if no Mao, no re-education program, no mass deaths, if no Stalin, no 20 million dead, I'm not sure. Right. But I know that at least with World War II, it needed a figure at the top who had created almost this messianic type of following, and that was Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right. That one person can make such a difference. Just think of Putin today. Why don't the Russians stand up against him? Well, you see what happens to his enemies. He kills them, or they're imprisoned, right? So, you have that kind of collective action problem. What's it called? Belling the cat, right? So the mice decide we're going to put a bell around the cat so we hear him coming. Okay, who's going to do it? You go. Well, no, I'm not going to bell him, right?
Yeah, and it's very interesting. And, all of them, when we talk about these characters who were such powerful characters and so much death left under them, they were very good at making the population feel there was somebody always after them. So with Hitler, it was the Jews. They were going to destabilize society. With Stalin, it was the West. They're going to bring down communism. They're going to stop us. With Mao, it was definitely that we just got rid of the Chiang Kai-shek, and the West is coming back in to put us back 3,000 years. So you're always pushing on who that enemy is. And Putin does that very well. Here he is, saying this is a fight against NATO. NATO is destabilizing us, trying to have that work. But it's harder to do today in a world of social media. Even when you try to block Twitter and Facebook and all those apps from working, people have a way to work around them. China is finding that problem. What would have happened in World War II, Michael, if People had cell phones and were
Right.
recording
Social
the
media.
murders on the East and the Eichmann group and in the camps and sending them on private chats to family members who then sometimes leaked them to the web. Would there have been an uprising? Would the Pope have spoken out earlier against the Holocaust? Maybe so.
Maybe. Yeah, it's hard to tell. Daniel Goldhagen wrote that book, Hitler's Willing Executioners. You probably read that. So to what extent did Hitler's message fall on friendly ears? Like, yeah, it would be nice if we got rid of the Jews. Maybe no one citizen in that little town wants to do that. But once, the process is underway, they're not going to resist. Or maybe they'll even help a little bit.
Yeah, I think that that book was, I know it was controversial. I found it to be a compelling book. He makes a very strong argument for it, and he does what he should do. He provokes good discussion. But the idea that, after World War I, when Germany was so pushed down by the Versailles Treaty, this rampant inflation and everything else, and they're made to feel so weak, the idea that somebody could come to them so soon afterwards, and this was soon in the early 30s, and say, by the way, you know what? We can be great.
We can rise up.
We can rise up. We should. And the people who set us up the first time, we're going to get them this time. Those are the Jews. Boy, it falls on a lot of ears that are willing to hear that.
Yeah, for sure. So Hugo Mercier's book, Not Born Yesterday, I like to cite a lot because he talks about to what extent people are naturally gullible and fall for people like Hitler or Trump or whoever, cults or whatever. So his argument is that actually most people are not that gullible, right? Most people don't join cults. They sign up for self-help groups or these motivation seminar coaches or whatever, like Tony Robbins, and nothing bad happens. We can name the cults, Jim Jones and Jonestown and the Scientology and the Heaven's Gate or Waco and the Branch Davidians. Right. There's just really a few that, in fact, and we parade them as if, look how gullible and stupid people are. Well, actually, probably most people don't join cults like that. And the few that do, the standouts are the ones we want to, well, how come they fell for that, right? Like the case of Bernie Madoff, he had a kind of affinity scam, right? He's appealing to Jewish communities. Well, like, he's one of us, he wouldn't cheat us. And so forth. But actually, most people don't, fall for these kind of financial scams. This is Mercier's argument. So in the case of Hitler and the Nazis, his argument is that while there were willing executioners, that anti-Semitism was pretty rampant in Europe, certainly in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and so on, but not executionist or eliminationist anti-Semitism, just kind of the normal background anti-Semitism at the time. It took something else to get people to not resist the exterminationist program, right? And that it was actually hard to do that. This is his argument. And I think there might be something to that. And then if you don't have a free press, you lock anybody up who resists, right? And everybody sees what happens to this guy. He stood up and look, he's gone. They came in the middle of the night and they took him off to Dachau. Well, I'm going to keep my mouth shut, right? And there's no press, there's no social media. So how can any one person do anything about it? And then the thing just kind of cascades along for years.
It's like a virus.
It is like a virus.
It's like a brainwashing as well.
But you often say, Trisha, that it's this gradual slide.
Yeah, it's a gradual slide.
So that it's not like Hitler comes in 1933 and says, "Okay, we're going to kill the Jews." Although, if you could read his writing,
it's almost like one of his speeches. He revs it up,
keeps revving it up,
revving it up.
And the thing is that's so fascinating to us is that in the beginning, they have this 20 or 30,000 sterilization. They start sterilizing the people who otherwise are going to pollute the Aryan race, and then they have this T4 program. It's called euthanasia, in which they are eliminating people with mental defects and
gypsies, gay.
At that time, not even just really more mentally defective or people that they thought were going to pollute, quote unquote, the master race. What's fascinating about that is as that word became a secret that wasn't a secret, people worked at those centers, talked about it in their local communities, it became known. There was a pushback from the German population about it, and Hitler, in response, moved it over to Poland once the war started. So the Germans weren't immediately ready for the elimination of millions of people. They didn't know at first that the Eichmann group and these mobile killing squads were going out in Russia and shooting people by over 1 million. it was this slide into it. And even, in terms of, you look at Germany itself and the Nazis, this idea we're going to get the Jews to leave Europe. We're going to kick them out.
Yeah.
We're moving to Madagascar. And when none of that works, then you finally have the conference in January of 43. It says, okay, we're going to have to kill them all.
Final solution.
And they're there. By that point, the Nazis are there. And like you said, the public's in the middle of a war. No one's going to speak up against the right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There was that debate on intentionalists versus functionalists. To what extent does the Holocaust result from, Hitler intended from 1923 or whatever to kill all the Jews, or was it kind of a gradual byproduct of the war and how things went? And if they could have just deported all the Jews out of Europe to Madagascar or whatever, that would have been fine, but they couldn't do that. And as the early successes in the war, they got even more Jews into the Reich, then it just became impractical. So then you kind of make that shift. I kind of lean more toward the functionalist thing. That's usually how history goes. It's almost never as top-down controlled as it seems like in hindsight, right?
I think
because things are
we
complex.
Think that's right. We think that's right. Look, if they had been able to get a country to say yes, we'll accept all the Jews, and they were able to send them there at that point, that might have avoided what became millions of deaths. And remember, there was something else I think that Hitler was very smart at, though. Besides all his writings, and he steeped into the typical long centuries-old anti-Semitism that was rife in Europe, as you said, they were able to play very well against the fact that after they went to war with the Soviet Union, first they had the pact, but once they went to war with them, the idea that Bolshevism, this threat of Europe, that's really Jewish. Remember, so many of the early Marxists, the people who wrote the Communist Manifesto, they're all Jews. We've had people say to us, Marxism and Bolshevism, it's Jewish. So I said, okay, then I'll tell you what, I'll accept that if you accept that Nazism is Lutheran and Catholic, because all of the heads of the Third Reich were either Lutheran or Catholic. They weren't practicing. They didn't go to church on Sundays and that. So if you want to say that the secular, atheist, non-practicing Jews who formed communism made it a Jewish political thing, then I'll buy Nazism as a Lutheran and Catholic one. And then they say, no, that's different. And you realize it's not at all. But Hitler played that very well as well, to say they're also behind our greatest threat now, Bolshevism.
Right. Yeah, there's always that comments made by theists. Well, Stalin was an atheist and Hitler was an atheist and so on. That's what atheism leads to. No. It's in a way, communism was a faux religion. Nazism was a faux religion.
Right.
The 1,000-year Reich, that doesn't come out of nowhere. That's the millennium.
Right.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's no doubt about that that you had replaced what I call religion, a monotheistic religion with a single God up on top, with an earthly religion, the religion that you could follow here. And there's no doubt about that. Those movements, as opposed to being, that's a better way, as you say it, of describing it, as opposed to calling it it's not really, it's more a religion than it is a clique or a cabal or
way of life.
Or as you were saying with Koresh and everybody else before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like also the interesting thing is the appeal of the Nazis to a lot of young men these days. Why is it that they don't want to be Napoleonic soldiers or World War I Germans? There's something about the Nazis and the uniforms and the parades and the flags. And I don't know, when Jennifer moved here from Germany a decade ago, we're just channel surfing the History Channel. It's like all Hitler all the time. And she's like, what's with you Americans? I mean, we got over this guy decades ago. It's like this, all I see on TV is the Nazis.
But very interesting you say that, because we've talked about the Leni Riefenstahl films. There was a power to, and I don't mean power in a good sense, not in awe or anything else, but they presented a power in terms of these mass formations, 10,000 troops, all holding the banners, the groups at night, it gave a sense that an order and movement was underway.
Because they, like you said, with the uniforms, they were perfectly groomed, there was this order.
Even in terms of the SS, the death's head caps, the idea of fear, you coming into communities and you're invading the towns now. You come in as the SS officers, the pure blood, the elite. You're the ones with the death head skull on the. That's not usually something you see on an army captain's head. They were very, very attuned to the way that it looked, and that's why
fear.
she was and power
and fear.
and feeding that very, very much.
I forget the name of that British comedians who have a little spoof video where they're two SS soldiers and they're talking amongst themselves about the enemy, and then he goes, I've just noticed we have this death skull here. Are we the baddies?
I'm sure that's been fun.
That's
pretty funny.
That's very British humor.
And what's amazing is, so you'll understand this, after World War II in America and in Britain, people would often say in a conversation, what did you do during the war? That was a typical thing to say if somebody was a war age. That's the question never asked in Germany.
Right.
I talked to young Germans afterwards. Their families never talk about it. It would be considered extremely rude to say, what did you do during the war? Because it might not be a good answer. And as a result, when the war fell down and after it was over, like your wife said, Germany got over it decades ago, but in part that's because they stopped talking about it. They wanted to get it in the background as fast as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a problem. Well, she also said, that growing up and going to school, it was made clear we are never, ever, ever, ever going to do this again, right? I mean, we're going to learn from this. So they know the history, but they just don't obsess about it. Yeah, there's something about, what's her name, the filmmaker,
Lenny Riefenstahl.
Lenny Riefenstahl. Yeah. That film, Triumph of the Will, that does encapsulate the power of that, right? Nighttime, the torches, the marching.
Yes.
And, there is research in social psychology about, kind of dancing, marching. It brings people together, makes them feel like a unit. And in a positive way, that's good, right? And it doesn't take much, right? Like a stadium, I'm told that you can get a wave going around a stadium with just like a dozen people, get it started, right? And people kind of naturally fall into that. It just feels good to be part of a kind of a movement like that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And in some ways, when you think about it, I mean, the Mao started the Mao suit. Everybody wore the same.
Yes.
That didn't necessarily empower people, but at least, it was a change. Yeah. It was a way of using clothing to make everybody feel as though you were the same. You were the same as the Politburo member who was driving by in a car with a security detail because he had the same suit on, even though it really wasn't true. He might be able to get his child into a hospital for emergency care before you could as a peasant, but that was on the side. And you didn't really have it in Russia to the same extent, but there's no doubt that Hitler understood, and the people around Hitler, Goebbels and propaganda ministry, Himmler and the SS, they understood the power of that impression and what it left on the public.
That presentation.
And that's right. And they were very, very much about that.
Yeah. Going to read a couple of sections here from, this is from the Moral Arc, but that book, The Good Old Days, The Holocaust is Seen by Its Perpetrators and Bystanders. This is SS Obersturmfuhrer, Lieutenant Colonel Karl Kretschmer, apologizing to his wife for being gone so long, and he's writing here, Dear Soska, I'd like to be with you all. What you see here, he's on the kind of the Einsatzgruppen front line there, I think it was. Yeah, September 1942, right. I'd like to be with you all. What you see here makes you either brutal or sentimental. His gloomy mood, he explains, is caused by the sight of the dead, including women and children. His moral conflict resolved by coming to believe that the Jews deserve to die. As the war is, in our opinion, a Jewish war, the Jews are the first to feel it. Here in Russia, wherever the German soldier is, no Jew remains. By the way, how do the deniers deny this? Okay. You can imagine that at first I needed some time to get to grips with this. In a subsequent letter, not dated, Kretschmer explains to his wife how he did come to grips with the conflict. There's no room for pity of any kind. You women and children back home could not expect any mercy or pity if the enemy got the upper hand. For that reason, we are mopping up here where necessary, but otherwise the Russians are willing, simple, and obedient. There are no Jews here anymore. Right. Yeah. So that's right. He's part of the Einsatzgruppen. Right. So, and we know when the Russians came through, right, they did rape and pillage German citizens.
Well, but Stalin, very smart in his diabolical sense, he pushed onto the front lines Russian soldiers who had lost family members, who had lost a brother or somebody else. Now, that was a lot of Russians because so many millions had been killed, but he wanted the front lines to be savage. He did not want them hesitating. And so the people on the front lines of the Russians were looking for payback often, and it was absolutely devastating. But at the same time, so interesting when you read that, because the things that amaze us are the letters sometimes from Auschwitz home, in which one of the SS men assigned to the camp is writing about what they had for dinner that night.
Yeah.
And we had a special goose tonight. We've been waiting for it for a month. And then the schnapps and this and that and everything else. Only when you go back to the records in the camp of what happened that day, do you know that there was an action, as they called it, of an arriving group of 15,000 Jews from Serbia or from Transylvania that were murdered, gassed. They worked for 8 hours in getting the bodies put away. None of that is mentioned. Just, so they're able to morph into this, like what looks
separate.
That compartmentalization.
That's the word,
is really remarkable in some cases. And you're right.
Or complaining about the weather in winter.
Yeah, they're complaining about what a terrible assignment it is to be at Auschwitz, back to their families, how bad the weather is. And you think they are in winter coats or that, and the inmates are in nothing, but they're not worried. Also, Michael, it was the commandant of the Treblinka camp, Franz Stangl, who said when he was on trial that we made them look less than human.
Yes.
We wanted them to be underweight, starving. We wanted them like a dog fighting for a piece of bread if one fell, so that we thought of them as animals. It made it easier for the men and the women, a few, to be able to process their duties if they didn't think of them as human.
Yeah, another book, Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, is that story of the Yusufov massacre and this police battalion that were conducting this. He reports that 10 to 20% of the Nazi reservists withdrew from the killing operation after one shot. Because they had been ordered to shoot him at, just put the gun right up to the head, and brains splatter all over the place. And it was difficult for them. As one reservist explained truthfully, I must say at the time we didn't reflect about it at all. Only years later did any of us become truly conscious of what had happened then. Apparently a lot of them got shit-faced. They just got drunk after these actions.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of disobedience, so they moved the killing from a further distance, or ultimately used the gas chambers and so on, but because of that kind of natural impulse. So here again from Karl Kretschmer, referencing the Einsatz group. And if it weren't for the stupid thoughts about what we're doing in this country, the Einsatz here would be wonderful, since it has put me in a position where I can support you all very well, right? He's a careerist. Since, as I already wrote to you, I consider the last Einsatz to be justified and indeed approve of the consequences it had, the phrase stupid thoughts is not strictly accurate. Rather, it is a weakness not to be able to stay on the side of dead people. The best way to overcome it is to do it more often, then it becomes a habit.
Yeah, amazing. Very interesting that, the generals running the Einsatz group, and they realized, like you said, that this was taking a toll on the men doing it in terms of being too much. So they go through a process where they're no longer having the police regiment shoot directly with the gun at the back of the head where it splatters all over. They have them do it from a distance. It's still taking a toll on them. That's where you get Walter Ralph tasked with the idea of doing carbon monoxide into vans. And so you could kill 87,000 people in a little van with carbon monoxide, because then you don't have to be involved directly in the shooting. And then eventually you get to Auschwitz and the gas chambers. So they keep trying to create some distance from the killers.
That's right. For them.
So that you don't have to confront what you're doing in terms of seeing somebody's head splatter in front of you.
Yeah. It's hard to believe we have to even talk about it like this.
I know.
Though, Michael, I think it's interesting. It's important. I'm glad you do, because I see so many things now that we go to watch a program on cable, or we open up and it says, be careful. There's violence in here. Be careful. You might be bothered. And there are people who would be triggered by this discussion because it's very frank and it is very graphic. But we can't talk about it. I mean, imagine these victims went through it. They suffered. They died from it. This is what transpired, and what you're reading are the actual letters from the perpetrators and how they try to justify it. I think it's very important. I hope that as we keep going along in history, we don't get to the point where, oh my God, we can't talk about the Holocaust because it's so violent. That's the very reason we should be talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you make of the moral equivalency argument that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg were also kind of war crimes, but we won, so it's treated differently. What is the difference there? Is it that after we did that, the killing stopped, whereas the Germans would not have stopped until they had completely exterminated every last Jew?
Well, no, I think interesting you say that. I mean, they clearly made a calculation inside of Washington that if they had to do a land invasion of Japan, the Japanese would have fought for every inch of Japanese territory as they had fought for Iwo Jima and the islands. And the death tolls were so high on the islands, and the atolls on that would have been astronomical on the American end. So that was part of that calculation, without any doubt. The bombings of Dresden clearly wasn't done to stop the war, was to weaken the enemy and the resolve of the enemy by hitting a civilian target. The British knew they were hitting a civilian target. Today, if we have collateral damage from a drone and a family gets killed, it's front page news and there's an investigation. Today, I do think that if there was a civilian bombing of a city like Dresden, oh my God, you'd have every military officer who was involved in planning that, right? It would lose their rank. So it was a different type of war. That's not to say better or worse. It was a different
time. I don't think you can. It's a different time that we were going to.
But this idea that Roosevelt knew and they should have bombed Auschwitz or whatever to stop the Holocaust from happening, wasn't there calculation that we can save more Jews and everybody if we just end the war earlier?
Well, I mean, so I'm really convinced from my own research on that, and we've looked at this and we haven't published on it, that while the planes late in the war, American planes and British planes could have reached Auschwitz, and some bombs were dropped on the outskirts, we could not. There was no precision bombing. No. People forget about that. They think you had to do some carpet bombing. You would have killed possibly inmates. You might have killed more inmates than you killed Nazis at the time. We didn't know which ones were the exact barracks or the centers for the gassing. So the idea of being able to do an effective run, and then the second question is, well, why didn't we bomb the rail lines themselves?
Yeah,
that was seriously discussed to stop the trains from going. But I will say that what trumped that in the end was the decision by military planners to say, in a crass way, I'm not sending one plane to stop a civilian tragedy from unfolding that I can use in a military sense to end this war. The military guys got it every time. Was that the right decision? No, I would have loved to have seen them bomb the rail tracks, right, if nothing else. But that they never did. They just always said, we'll do it later. We'll do it later. And later it was too late.
Yeah, Freeman Dyson makes the point. He's the great British scientist who during the war worked in doing calculations about the effectiveness of these mass bombings. And his conclusion was they weren't very effective at slowing the war effort. It's very difficult to hit anything with precision. Also that the Germans, they put these trains back running again within a few days. The factories are back up and running. Right.
It's a very rudimentary rail system. It is not an electronic high-speed train. Right. It would have been up and running in no time. And, we do think when we talk about, things you say, what's a war crime, what's not, one of the things that would have been a war crime, I think, without a doubt, is Hitler's use of indiscriminate V-2 rockets into London. They didn't know where those would land. Might land in an orphanage, might not. They were being sent in. They weren't precision guided. And then the planes hitting civilian. So the very same thing that the Germans sometimes complain about, with Allied planes, once the Allied planes could reach Germany and the air power wasn't there for the Luftwaffe, Hitler was doing beforehand when he was trying to break the will of the British people. War is a dirty business. We see that in Ukraine and Russia, no doubt about it. We've forgotten how dirty it can be, but World War II particularly so. Yeah,
particularly in this context, it seems like U.S. support of Ukraine now, standing up to Putin, would be like Chamberlain should have stood up to Hitler. And yet now it's the Republicans. I see yesterday DeSantis said, this is a waste of U.S. resources. We should be focusing on our own domestic issues rather than Ukraine. And then Trump, it follows up by topping, if I'm reelected, I will end the war overnight. It's like, okay, how are you going to do that? Right?
But, it's interesting. But Michael, didn't we have in the lead up to World War II, I'll use it an overgeneralization, but the isolationists, or those who didn't want to get involved in Europe's war, were often Republicans. Yes. I mean, it was the party that said, that's Europe's war. People, even in the Democratic Party, there were people that resisted Roosevelt's effort to say this is our war as well. So, now you have this idea, well, you know what? Russia's not a threat to us. It's a land war over there between these two countries, and forget about it. And I'm thinking, boy, you heard all types of things in the 30s leading up to finally.
History repeats itself.
Yeah, Charles Lindbergh led the American Firsters, they were called. Right.
And Lindbergh was amazing because he got an award from Hitler. The Germans liked him. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, had a picture of him in the office. The two pictures that Hitler had in his office was, for a while he had Lindbergh, but he took him down. The last American he had a picture of in the office that he took down was Henry Ford.
Henry Ford, yeah.
Because he thought that Ford's Eternal Jew, which is an unrelenting anti-Semitic book, was a guideline for many of the Nazis.
Yeah. Did you know Lindbergh had a whole German family that no one knew about in his lifetime, or even up until, I mean, his big biography was like mid-90s. And that guy, I forget the author's name, he did not know Lindbergh had this family. Yeah, what was his name?
Berg, wasn't it Berg?
Yes. And it didn't come out till like the 2000s with the DNA testing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that he had this whole other German family, and they, the mother called him Uncle Charles or whatever, but he was really the father. Yeah, this has now been confirmed through DNA testing. Astonishing. He was into the German thing. Yep, definitely. Astonishing. Yeah.
And I think, and that also fed a degree of anti-Semitism in the U.S., as you know, with the Bund and others, the big rallies, the idea that, it's a European war, and the Jews of Europe are trying to get us involved in a European war to settle this war because they don't like Hitler. And I think that created problems here for a while. If the Japanese had not made that great blunder, and I don't mean to minimize the deaths of Americans there, but blunder in terms of their own strategic mistake at Pearl Harbor, and we had not gotten involved for another 6 or 8 months, maybe Britain would not have been able to hold out.
Yeah. Yeah, in my conspiracy book, I talk about the 9/11 truthers they have a kind of debate amongst themselves about whether Bush let it happen on purpose, lie hop, or made it happen on purpose, my hop, right? Well, I call it cow hop, capitalized on what happened on purpose, right? So, of course he didn't have anything to do with 9/11, but once it happened, it's like, hey, let's invade Afghanistan. And while we're over there, I'm going to finish my dad's job, right? And so Roosevelt, same thing. He wants to get America in. The American firsters no. Okay, then Pearl Harbor happens. He didn't make it happen. He didn't know it was going to happen. But after the fact, okay, this is how conspiracies really work, right? I'm going to capitalize on what happened for our purposes.
And it is remarkable, you think about that, but as with 9/11, the country being so unified, you see a country here that was split about whether they were going to war, whether they wanted to. And after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was able to give that speech to Congress, and the country was united. Everybody was ready to go. And Germany, of course, declares war on the U.S. once we declare war on Japan, which is another mistake. So any chance they have of being left aside for a moment disappears very quickly.
Since you wrote a book on 9/11, what happened? How come we didn't know that was going to happen? What was the problem there?
I think the problem there was that and this will sound old to some of your listeners or to many of them, but the CIA and the FBI were not communicating with each other in the lead up to 9/11. And the worst example where it could have been prevented was the CIA was monitoring these two known terrorists, who went to a Malaysian conference. They got Malaysian intelligence to actually make a videotape of them, but they couldn't get sound. So we know what they look like. They came from Saudi Arabia. Those two terrorists who have been identified by the CIA then came into the U.S. This is in early 2000, into California, where they settled. They took out driver's license in their own names. They got jobs. They were two of those on the 9/11 crew that day on the attack. One was a pilot, Al-Madar. Now, the CIA in the summer of 2001, when there's a lot of chatter going on and they're picking it up, gets a little nervous. And that's the point at which they tell the FBI about these two people. And the FBI looks for them, but it's too late to find them. So they don't find them beforehand. If they had told the FAA about it and put them on the no-fly list, when they made the reservations for the flights in their real names, we would have stopped it. So, looking backward, you always look smart Monday morning because you know where the holes were. This is one of those situations in which we just didn't put the intelligence together, in part because it wasn't being shared. It was preventable. It's a shame.
Yeah. Do you worry about the overreaction, though, to it? Homeland Security and all the massive security theater, and we got to take our shoes off, and the airport and all the crazy stuff. And,
no, we talked about that. I mean, we were in New York at the time, and the change was remarkable. I mean, it was like just even walking into your publisher.
Yeah, into the publisher. I'd go to Random House, and suddenly I had to sign in at the desk. I used to be able to run in and go upstairs. We're old enough to remember taking the shuttle in New York. You'd take Eastern Shuttle or whatever to go to Washington, and they had a flight every hour. And if you got there just before it left,
The runner.
You'd run down the aisle, and they'd say, "We have a runner." They would tell the gate, "You have a runner." Today they would tackle you, and you'd be held.
Yeah.
So the changes are remarkable, but that is also money. That is a security industry, a post 9/11 security industry.
I think all these, that what you said is very true. They create an industry like COVID. They created an industry, and they can't go back because they're making so much money out of it.
And it's also liability, because if they go back and the first person, whoever pulls off a bombing inside a building that didn't have to sign in, but it's clearly, how many people are employed by TSA? I don't know, but it's
huge.
Huge.
And all those scanning machines.
In the hospitals, you have security now.
Yeah, no, it's quite
everywhere. Yes, Ed Snowden, one of my favorite clips from Ed Snowden on the Joe Rogan show. Joe's into conspiracy theories, right? So so Snowden goes, "Let me tell you how it really works, Joe. It's not cigarette smoking man behind closed doors running the world, right? It's just bureaucrats who just trying to keep their job and keep, we got to fill if we don't use the budget, then they're going to cut our budget. So we have to increase this and have these threats, because without the threats, what are we even doing here, right?"
So we have to keep on reinventing and reinventing.
No, it's absolutely true. And what I always ask is, and we have this discussion sometimes, so you have the security apparatus that comes in after 9/11, and then every time we have an attack subsequent to that, was it stopped by the security apparatus? For instance, July 7th, 7/7 in England.
7/7,
There was an attack on the buses and on the subway. None of the security apparatus would have stopped it. It wouldn't stop it. And so people who have an intent to try to hurt you will figure out a way around the security that you have set up.
And they had security for years in England. I mean, you were there.
Yeah.
When the IRA were threatening to bomb. So we were used to that.
Yeah, I had Fred Kaplan on the show a couple of years ago. He wrote a book called The Bomb. So he's a kind of longtime journalist tracking nuclear weapons and mutual assured destruction, all that game theory stuff, really interesting stuff. But in his book, he makes the point that there was two arms races between the U.S. and USSR, but within the U.S. between the military services. And this is how we ended up with the triad, right? Airplanes, missiles, and submarine-based nuclear weapons, because each military division said, well, we want in on this. It's a huge budget. We can get, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to make these things. And so they kind of create this security threat that we have to have. So he points out, for example, so Eisenhower warned us about this, right? The military industrial complex, that each of them has to justify why they're spending the money. So, well, what are you going to bomb with those nuclear weapons? And he points out there's some sites in Siberia that are, they're so remote, they're only open like 1 month out of the year. And we have like 100 nuclear weapons targeted on that particular site. Why? Well, because we have to have the bombs for something, because we made the bombs.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it is fulfilling the budgets in that. There's no question about it.
But what do you do about it, right? Because the moment you say, well, we should start cutting back, then, well, what about, we don't want the mushroom cloud over our country, as Bush described it. It's like, really? Can terrorists really do that?
I find that one of the things that happens in 9/11 was a moment that changed. Living in New York, it was a terrible moment for all Americans, but especially being in New York.
Living there, yeah.
But I think that what happens is the complex, the military-industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, they get their best gains based upon fear. So when people are afraid, they're willing to give up a little personal liberty.
Yes,
they're willing to spend a little bit more. And so if you have that idea that there could be a dirty bomb attack, you have the idea that maybe somebody's going to get off as patient zero with tuberculosis and spread it through New York City. And, these articles run in the New Yorker, and then the Times will have something on it. And there was a period in which we all thought a dirty bomb was coming any moment. Well, you're ready to say, give a blank check to the people protecting us.
Do what you have to do.
Yeah. There was even these security companies selling parachutes to business people in high rises, just in case.
Oh, I don't think did you do that?
I don't think I knew that.
It was part of the whole prepper. Here's some of the things you could do. You should have, bottled water and things like that. But you should also have a parachute if you're in a high rise.
That's
crazy.
Fantastic.
That's crazy.
That's pretty
All right.
great.
So what's the U.S.-Saudi connection there? What is the deal? You always hear this, that the Saudis left America on 9/12. Why did that happen? And there was something. Conspiracy theorists talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the the royal family had bought peace with bin Laden and the real hardliners by saying essentially, we'll continue to give you some money and access to your money, but go and play jihad elsewhere. Don't do it in the kingdom. So they were able to do it in Sudan. They would go up to Afghanistan. And the family thought that by doing that, they wouldn't have a problem internally. There was going to be no uprising on the holy sites where, Mecca and fine. But it came back to haunt them because 9/11 was something that if they'd been able to stop, they would have, because they know how that ruptured the whole world. The problem is that for a while, it did rupture the relationship that we had with them. But what's put it back in form is Iran. Although the Saudis have come to an agreement to restore diplomatic relations with Iran after all these decades just last week, it's a very strained relationship between the Sunni empire of the Saudis, the Wahhabis, and the Shia empire of the Ayatollahs. And that has brought the Saudis and the UAE and Qatar closer to Israel and made the Abraham Accords possible. And maybe the Saudis will this year or next year be able to get over a couple of hurdles and do their own deal with Israel. The alignment of the Middle East has been different. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Boy, in the Middle East, that really counts because everybody has a cross purpose. But in this case, I think the Saudis would have been praised much more by the world for taking these first steps toward liberalizing for women driving, the things they have done, and then the murder of Khashoggi and the involvement of the Crown Prince set them back.
Right. Yeah, I always feel like I don't really know what's going on, and I watch the news and I read articles online and so on about all this stuff, and I always feel like I just really don't know because there's probably other stuff going on we don't know now and we'll know in 20 years or something like that. And so this is my concession to conspiracy theories. When you get elected president, they take you in the back room and they go, okay, here's what's actually going on. What? I said I'd close Gitmo. Yeah, I know. Don't worry about it. You can't do that. We're going to pull the troops out. No, you're not pulling the troops out. Oh, yeah, because if I do that, then this happens. All right, never mind. But I said on the campaign trail I would. Don't worry about it.
That's
very good. I like that.
Like that, right? But and I have a feeling that first meeting, they say to you, you can't take any notes. And
right.
So just remember it all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because, it's like you just don't know because there's reasons to keep things secret from our citizens. But how much? That's a hard one. That's, Snowden revealed this and that. Is he a hero or not? I don't know. It's good that we know what our government's doing and that they lied to Pentagon Papers, the Afghanistan Papers. They do lie to us, but maybe sometimes it's okay.
But though, when you say something about Snowden and that, and I'm pretty much a believer in, okay, get as much as you can, get it out in the public. But I like the way Daniel Ellsberg did it with the Pentagon Papers. He went to the New York Times and said, here it is. So Snowden had gone to the Times or the Washington Post or a network or whatever and said, here it is. And they said, we're not interested. Then he could do exactly what he did. I just hate the first step being releasing it yourself, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because there's no editing selection process. Apparently there were names revealed that,
That's
were
right.
Spies
exactly.
or whatever.
And you would not have had that happen if a newspaper did it. Correct. Now, some people who are Snowden fans would say, well, that's the way it should be done. Well, everything for people to see.
Should be raw.
But exposing the names of intelligence agents serves no purpose at all. And it was a danger. And so I think that was a step too far against that one.
All right. Let's kind of wrap it up with one last big topic here. Since you wrote a book on the Vatican, what's the future of the Catholic Church? One of my other hobbies, the decline of religion, the rise of the nuns, and again, my wife's from Germany, so it's very Catholic. And there's massive scandals over there, the sex scandals and all the corruption scandals. And I've been hearing since I was like in college, the Vatican's going to collapse and and I just don't see it happen. They just have so much wealth and property and so on, but their membership rolls are declining.
The membership rolls are,
definitely.
And you're right. Francis, is trying to figure out a way to re-energize the church. They're losing Catholics, not just who are lapsed Catholics to no faith at all, but they're losing Catholics in Central America and South America to Pentecostal faiths. The same in the Philippines and others. There are religions coming in, Pentecostal leaders who say, guess what? Catholicism's failed you. That's not the vicar of Christ on earth. They're a fake religion over there. They've sold themselves out with pedophilia and all this wealth and that. Here, we're the real deal. So they're being hit on all ends. I'm surprised in some ways, and we've talked about this, that the church hasn't been hurt more by
Definitely.
the $2-3 billion it's had to spend in the U.S. on the sex scandals. $2 billion in settlement, $1 billion in expenses. You are a Catholic parishioner, and every Sunday they pass the basket around and you put $5 in, and now your good earned donation is going to an archdiocese. There are 17 that have gone bankrupt because of these. I'd be furious if I was a member of the faithful. I understand that these are humans, but they're flawed, but still, I'm
they don't
surprised
see
the church.
what you see.
Right.
Like your own mother.
My mother was very devout and stayed devout.
His mother
all the
was
time.
very devout.
I say in the beginning of the book, Michael, about God's bankers, I say, this isn't about religion. It's not about which religion is right or wrong. If you're a devout Catholic, fine. But it is really a real reminder that people are mortal. They make mistakes. And just because they decide to go into a nunnery or become a priest, sometimes they are subject to the same shortcomings on greed or on sexual abuse or drug abuse that you are in civilian society. And the problem for the church has been that for so long it covered it up. Instead of saying, okay, we have a bad apple, we're defrocking that priest, we're sending him over to civil authorities so they can be prosecuted. They keep transferring him around.
They reassign him to somewhere else.
Yeah, it was a bad story.
Bad.
Yeah, billions of dollars in restitution for the victims, but what's the Catholic Church worth? I mean, it must be.
Well,
we just had this discussion recently. A journalist asked us, and it's impossible to determine.
It's impossible. I think you can't. You walk into the Vatican, you look, and you think.
The reason is
it's like trying to put a price on crown jewels.
On the balance sheet for the Vatican, they list the Sistine Chapel, all of the map rooms and everything else, everything that's a collected piece of art, all the Michelangelos and that, as worth €1. So that's what the value is. So clearly that's not the case. What they're really saying is we don't want to sell any of that. But
and
imagine the stuff we have not seen.
The size of the Vatican is, in terms of its size, about the size the Vatican Bank of a regional bank in the U.S. About that size, which may not be a good comparison now with the regional bank problems, but that's about the size of it.
You mean on paper? That's what they're claiming to be.
That's right, on paper. And most of the money comes from investments in real estate that they have. Some of the best real estate, prime real estate in London and everywhere else, they bought decades and decades ago. So they own some great property. They pay the largest property owner in New York City is the Catholic Church, and then comes the New York City government. They pay no property tax on any of that, as you know. So it's a major thing. And donations still come in. And
I don't know where we go after Francis. I don't know where it will go. He's supposedly someone that told us is on the inside, right?
That he might be getting retiring.
Nearer to retirement. He's quite poorly health-wise.
Right. So they just made that decision on same-sex marriage. Well, sort of, right? They just said, well, gays are not going to hell after all. But are they going to have female priests? Probably not. Are they going to sign on with the pro-choice position on abortion? Probably not.
And even if you look at the details of the same-sex marriage, it says if it's allowed by the civil law, so the civil law allows it. But in cases in which the civil law didn't allow it, such as in Ireland when they had the vote in recent years, the Catholic Church was the one that really lobbied against it. The church is still adamantly opposed to gay adoption, to surrogates providing children to gay couples. So that takes away that thing. And so on the one hand, they give a little, he's very smart. Francis is the savviest of the popes in a while. In the very beginning, when he came to power, he said, when asked about gays in general, he said, who am I to judge?
Right.
Well, that was widely interpreted to mean, oh my God, they're breaking down the long bias. But that's a great question. Who am I to judge? Well, the answer to that is you're the vicar of Christ on earth, according to the church. So you can judge. Now, what do you judge? But nobody followed up.
Oh my God, that's too much. All right, guys, what are you writing next? What are you collaborating on for? What are you researching? I know you're up to something.
It's a debate, right?
Can you tell us?
Yeah.
Well,
Trisha's been dragging her feet on a project that you will read at some point because she has found it great. He's a guy called Francois Genoux. He was a Swiss financier. All you need to know about him, Michael, is he took this will be her next book. He took a lot of the money for the Third Reich and managed it after the war. And then he becomes the financier for early Arab terrorism. And
he's like the Forrest Gump.
Yeah, he's everywhere.
He's everywhere.
Oh my God.
He pays for the defense of Klaus Barbie when Klaus Barbie's on trial.
Really?
He pays for, and when Carlos the Jackal's on trial, he pays for his defense.
Whoa.
So he's a real, like,
I'm lucky because he's really into it. So.
I am into it. It's a great story. I said, Trish, it's a good story.
That is a
I'll
good
probably
story.
go back to the same publisher.
Yeah. So, and I don't
Gerald?
know what's next. I don't know.
Okay.
I keep saying, you know,
He comes up with all different ideas, but really the climate has changed tremendously.
Yeah, I mean,
You know, publishing has changed.
You
it's
have
not
to.
how everything else has changed.
It has to be something, Michael, and you know, anybody who's listening who's thinking of doing a book, you have to be passionate about it, but you have to get your publisher interested as well. And there's a two-part process, and so I'm always trying to convince the publisher that 2 years down or 3 years down the road, the public might be interested in this subject that I'm now approaching them with, but no one knows. Publishers sometimes get it right, and it's a bestseller, and sometimes they get it wrong, and the book doesn't sell. But you know, the publishing is this great sort of.
But we have a lot of other projects going on, documentaries, right?
There will be a Showtime. Showtime will have a 6-hour documentary of pharma later this year. It's being done by R.J. Cutler, the documentarian who did The War Room and all. He's great. They've worked on that for a year and a half now.
Then we have another project going on with Mengele, and so we have lots of little things going on to keep us busy at the moment.
Nice. So you don't have to write a biography of the royal family.
No, we do not.
You know, there are
Meghan.
We'll leave it to the experts.
So there are those moments, and you'll understand this because you've written so many books, and you know we pay our bills by writing and by doing things, and you work hard at it, and you know you'll sell 30,000 copies or 40,000 copies or whatever, and the publisher's happy with that because that's you know. And then you'll read about Prince Harry does a book and sells 1 million the first day. And it's not that I don't want to be writing a Prince Harry book, but it does make you very humble in your own approach as an author to realize that the market sometimes for serious history, bestseller books is tiny.
Well, I think the other one we just heard sold 1 million books was
Robert
Kennedy. Sold 1 million books.
Yeah,
I know.
Was that his Fauci book?
Yeah.
And
the real Fauci.
The real Fauci, and I think that's a reflection of sort of this tapped in, this anger about Fauci or the whole process with it. And then a book comes along like that, and it seems perfectly made to tap into that.
Yeah. I'd mocked up a fake book cover with my face on it. The cover looked just like the Harry biography, and I called it Share instead of Spare, and that I just want to lead a private, quiet life here in Santa Barbara. I don't want to be bothered with anybody. Leave me alone. So I'm going to go on Oprah, and I'm going to tell the whole story about my dysfunctional family. But don't come up to my house. Leave me alone.
That's fabulous. Yeah, it's quite fabulous.
That's very
it's
funny.
crazy.
That's very
Totally
good.
crazy.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. That was great.
Thank you.